Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the February edition of Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom with Jen and Carolyn. Jen, it's always good to see you. How are
You
you?
too, Carolyn. And both our girls are in college, going to
Not yet. I keep telling my daughter she can't actually fail, right? There's very clear language in the acceptance letter that you must maintain your good academic standing, and we're having a bit of a challenge on that point. Super excited for both of our guests to join us today. We are joined by John Canker, who is Managing Director of GravityPath and co-founder of WIVERSE. And then we're also joined by Hector Lopez, who's a director at NERA and author of two recent reports that we're going to get into. Jen, this larger conversation is about what we're seeing, and it's been going on, but maybe speeding up, is this idea of convergence, where you have companies who are no longer staying in their, I provide fiber, or I've got mobile, or I've got cable, and you're seeing companies offering multiple ways to access the internet and to have connectivity. So I thought bringing both the fiber and the spectrum world together for this discussion would be helpful in that regard.
Very.
Perhaps we can kick off with John, and then we'll, no pun intended, pull that fiber into the spectrum conversation.
Nicely
And
We're
done.
trying.
I should note that John is joining us from live on the ground of Metro Connect, which is really the biggest fiber conference in the industry. So, John, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Actually, lovely warm weather, 75 and sunny here in Fort Lauderdale. So definitely different than the cold weather in the Midwest. So enjoying that. Although haven't been outside much, mostly inside meetings inside the conference center.
So, John, maybe just starting from, on the ground reporting, what are you hearing? There's a lot of bankers, a lot of fiber players, a lot of private equity infrastructure funds there. What are kind of the key themes you're hearing from down in Fort Lauderdale?
Great question. Yeah, and I will say that I found the energy at this year's Metro Connect to be pretty exuberant. I mean, a lot of meetings, a lot of activity, a lot of buzz, and not just near-term buzz, but I think longer term buzz as well. And I think this is the first year, and you highlighted it, that convergence is really starting. All of these theses we've had as far as convergence, we're seeing it. We're seeing it in reality. And I think Carolyn's pun was perfect about fiber. Fiber tends to be a thread that runs through all of it. It really is such an important component of what is going to enable really this, what we call kind of an AI enabled ecosystem as we look forward. Fiber is a key connective thread through all of that. And as you said, there's a lot of recognition from the industry. In the last year, we saw the mobile operators getting into the fiber space really heavy with, Verizon with Frontier, AT&T Gigapower, T-Mo with Metronet and the Lumos joint venture. So you're starting to see that recognition that you can't just be a kind of a one trick pony in this industry to really take it into the next the next foray into this AI enabled ecosystem.
And I know Mark Yanzi was the keynote. Mark has been a guest on our show, our Nugget show, and a large part of his talking points was AI. And I'm curious, it feels like since the calendar turned to 2025, data centers are all the hype, but there's a recognition that data centers don't really work without a fiber plug behind them. And curious what you're hearing from down there from the AI side.
Absolutely. I love Mark, and that was perfect. He was the perfect keynote speaker, especially when you look at what Digital Bridge does and kind of all of the companies within that holding. I thought it set a great tone for this show. And it was interesting because again, this has been something we've been hypothesizing now for a while, is that you can't just look at you can't just look at the data center space only. You have to look at how do these things work. So it's so critical to be able, especially when you look at the data center challenges, whether that's power challenges, supply chain challenges, all of those things. The theme that we heard, not just from Mark, but from a lot of folks, is that, moving out more to the edge. So the idea of how in let's say the near term, well, more midterm, let's say within the next 5 years, that rather than accessing um, AI via data centers through a desktop, this is going to be your primary vehicle for accessing that. So, and that's just out of necessity because you gain a lot of efficiencies by moving that data out more to the edge. In order to do that, you have to have a lot more, middle mile and last mile fiber. You have to have a lot more in terms of better spectrum utilization. Mark may be misquoting this, but he talked about he was speculating on a 10x increase in mobile data traffic over the next 5 years. I think that was the number,
Yep.
which
And
is which
I think
is
our partner
a shock.
Hector here can confirm
Yeah,
for us when we start talking spectrum.
yeah, shocking number, but it's, I think he's exactly right. I think, maybe the number, maybe not necessarily on that specific number, but that need I believe is true, which again necessitates, more spectrum to enable that from the mobile operators.
Hey, Jen, if I could
Yeah,
I
sure.
just wanted to ask, you referenced, bankers, et cetera, and private equity being down there. And, private equity 15 years ago, I mean, you couldn't get them interested in telcos to save your life. But now, as you mentioned, John, folks are doing deals. Do you see this as a flash in the pan, or do you think private equity engaging here is, they're actually interested in this sector long term?
Yeah, no, I believe they're definitely interested in this sector because I think they are understanding that. There's some things that are going to need to happen to make it, to really, I think, get some real stronger momentum. There's been a lot of talk about aggregation of smaller fiber providers down here. Right now, a lot of it they're using debt for capital builds for their networks. But as companies are figuring things out and figuring out what's the right critical mass as far as deal size, I think we're going to see a lot more private equity interest in fiber specifically. I mean, we saw it last year, larger deals clearly, this past year, but I think we're going to continue to see more of that because people understand that the connective tissue of that. And the build forecast that we're seeing with with the operators, with, all of our check-ins, we don't see it slowing down anytime soon. The forecasts we've been hearing and echoed from a lot of people this week is, a build rate of about 10 million homes served per year. And that's a lot of fiber. And that's just FTTH. There's If you look at booked deals for middle mile, for long haul, there's a lot of capital projects on the books. With that comes different challenges, but a lot of those are on the books, and that we don't see that. The reality of it, Carolyn, is there's no real alternative to fiber to accomplish that. There just isn't. So it's almost a necessity that it has to happen.
And I guess that's a great segue to bring in Hector. I mean, one of the things I've often written and really quoted someone else, Ray LaChance, if he's listening, but is wireless needs wires. And, as you see this fiber plug happening, the edge and, the growth traffic predicted. I mean, is any of this surprising to you, Hector, based on your research and, knowledge from your seat?
No. It is not surprising, and I think that code is pretty accurate. Wireless needs fiber, needs connectivity, because the wire part is just the last connection, right, between your device and everything else. And it only really makes sense to use it when it is better than the alternative. And as costs for deploying fiber become cheaper over time, then fiber has to gain terrain. I mean, really, from the policy point of view, is like we need to have connectivity, and we need to use the best technical solution. So sometimes it's fiber, sometimes it's wireless, and it really depends on relative costs and benefits of these two technologies.
So actually, and thank you, Jen, for building the bridge and pulling fiber over into Spectrum. My God, we can go all day.
Indeed.
Hector, if you could, for the benefit of our audience that may
Yes.
not have read either of your reports, maybe we could start with the first one that came out just a few weeks ago, in which
Mhm.
I think you took a look at, exactly what would be the economic impact, economic relevance, if the federal government were to make available an additional 100 megahertz of spectrum. I think you did it in 4 tranches up to 400. So if they made 400 available, but they were auctioning it off in 100 megahertz tranches.
Mhm.
Walk us through kind of what your net bottom line is on what that economic impact could be. And then separately, if you could explain to us, sort of your methodology, how did you arrive at that as your bottom line?
Why would you let me reverse those questions? Because I think understanding where the value is generated is really just understanding the story of how spectrum is used. And it's relatively straightforward. So whenever you have a spectrum, commercial spectrum hit the market, the first thing needs to happen is to deploy and maintain that spectrum. That means the MNOs had to put new sites, new equipment, and turn on that particular frequency band. So that's the first thing that happens. So when you have a spectrum and infrastructure together, what you have is wireless capacity. So the ability to transmit data from mobile devices or some devices to the base station. And you need to ask, how is this capacity being used? Well, we use it in many ways. So the first one is just regular cell phone, making calls, watching Instagram, for example, or Facebook, or whatever you use, Amazon. The second one, more recent, is fixed wireless access. So in some places, as described, it is better for the consumer to have the last connectivity being over wireless than over wired. So fixed wireless access is yet another use case for that capacity. And then finally, the capacity is also used by businesses to sell the products and services they create. For example, again, if you look at Amazon, and I don't have the data on my head, but all the amount of purchases they have on mobile as opposed to on a desktop over wireless. So you start looking at the wireless capacity, not only as a service for the consumer, but as a platform for businesses. So it is really those 4 things that I consider in the paper. So the first economic impact is how much do the American economy grows because the MNOs are spending billions of dollars in infrastructure to turn on the spectrum. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which economically speaking, doesn't create GDP, but does create a lot of consumer benefit, is how much do we consumers enjoy better services, essentially at the same cost. And I mean, we have been using mobile for a really long time. I remember 10, 15 years ago, I still paid essentially the same price, but I couldn't do nearly half the things I could do now. There was no Amazon on the cell phone. There was no Uber on the cell phone. There was no streaming on the cell phone. And now I pay the same bill, but now I have all these amazing services. So that's consumer surplus, as we call it in economics. It's not GDP, but again, that's a really great benefit for consumers. Then you have fixed wireless. As you have additional capacity, then the MNOs have the ability to provide capacity to the places where fiber has not reached, for example, at a economical price. Maybe eventually, and this is an assumption in the paper, fiber will reach out. But in the interim, you need high connectivity. And when you are talking about somebody who is not connected with broadband, having their first connectivity because you have additional capacity to serve them in their house, that creates a great GDP and additional employment. And then finally, if you look at all the commerce that happens on the back of the wireless capacity, now imagine a situation in which you're trying to watch Netflix, for example, and the network is congested and you simply stop watching. And now when you think of, oh, should I renew my Netflix account or should I upgrade to the next thing? You say, well, maybe not, because it actually is congested. So it actually only works when I'm home. And if I'm home, I don't really need wireless. So all that economic activity that happens on the wireless capacity also has a value. So those are like the 4 things that create value. They have a really credible story behind them. And when you count the whole benefit, the 400 megahertz, it's about $1 trillion of GDP and about 6 million new jobs that will be created if the federal government makes available this 400 megahertz in relatively the short term, like in the next 5 years.
I mean, that seems like a pretty, not being an economist or an expert on labor or job growth, those seems like really important and very, very large numbers. Did you say 3 trillion in economic?
One trillion.
Okay.
1 trillion. Yes, 1.1, I think I have made a paper.
We're not quibbling over the trillions. I mean, that in and of itself is just amazing.
It is amazing. It is amazing. But I think that's how important it is, the wireless industry to the American economy. I mean, if you just do some introspection in your life and how much we use our cell phones, I mean, it is that important. So
Right.
everything that makes that experience better will have a huge impact on how the economy works.
And just to be clear, what you're looking at is commercial mobile spectrum allocations and the activity of and the investment by the mobile network operators. So the large scale, the
Yes.
Verizons, the AT&Ts, and the T-Mobiles. You did not include in your piece any of the economic activity that folks are trying to wrap around unlicensed, correct? You were really just looking at full power commercial.
That is correct. So the guiding principle of the paper is what would be the economic activity of allocating this to full power flexible licenses. Of course, the spectrum has other uses. And if somebody has sort of an alternative, they will have to essentially create the same paper and say, well, if we allocate this for unlicensed in this particular way, then the economics are going to be such and such. And then it's going to be the job of the policymakers to look at both papers and the whole collection of evidence that exists and make a decision.
So I don't want to hog this, and Jen, over to you, but one quick question. In the process of your research and putting together your analysis, was there, I assume you were looking at prior estimates of GDP impact and
Yes.
whatnot. In your research, did you come across examples of any other sector in, we'll call the broadband industry, that is investing as much as the MNOs are in building out acquiring the spectrum and building out the spectrum?
No, I mean, it's for this particular spectrum, it is the MNOs that are really supporting the whole economy, I would say.
Right.
I mean, they are the ones that deploy the spectrum. They are the ones that manage the capacity. So managing a network is actually a big deal. They are the ones who keep the relationship with the customers.
Right.
So that is really, really important. And then you also have the regulatory process, right? That also puts the rules on how that capacity must be used or not used. But yeah, it is the MNOs, big and small, that make this possible.
Jen?
I mean, it brings in a broader question, and Jen, I'll bring you back. I mean, all of this spectrum is clearly very important, but the MNO or the carriers right now have tremendous demands on their cash flow. It's kind of in the fiber bucket, but yet the majority of their cash flow comes from wireless. And I'm curious, as both of you see that, and I should note they've spent years repairing their balance sheets from pretty big spectrum bills they paid. Where do you see, maybe John, back to you, and then where do you see that dichotomy? I mean, you have large wireless roots in you. I mean, is it the push-pull? Where are they bending more toward the wireline side or the wireless side right now?
It's a great question. It's actually I think it is a push-pull. I do think that, and you're right. There's a lot of scar tissue from past spectrum spends, from certain investments that may or may not have worked out. But we are seeing spends by the mobile operators in areas that for a while now we haven't seen, where there's a recognition that the network quality needs to change, needs to be upgraded. A case in point would be, kind of the in-building network architecture. For years, as you know, that there's just not been carrier spend in that space. That's changing. There's a recognition.
Yeah.
Those networks have to be upgraded. That spend has to take place. And look, there's, as we said, there's a need for that as well. But I think you're right. There is this balancing act as far as spending on wireless net versus spending on your kind of the fiber backhaul that supports that. And it is a bit of a balancing act between where that money is being spent. But the reality of it is money is being spent. I mean, they're just being economical with that. So it will be curious. I will be curious to start to pay more attention to how do you factor spend on spectrum into that as well. It's going to be a found kind of a bit of a juggling act to figure out how that happens, because as we said, there's going to be need for that as you go forward.
And Hector and Carolyn, I turn this to you too. I guess from a spectrum standpoint, if we do get these auctions after a 2-year break of auctions, if I'm doing the math right, and now an FCC who do they have authority officially?
No, it has not been officially
not
restored.
not generally speaking, although they have
Okay.
authority for a few things.
But do you think there's large pent-up demand from the carriers to get their hands on more spectrum? Is that your
Well,
both?
yes, so there is pent-up demand, and I think, I mean, there was a previous estimate, not by me, by another economist, that he estimated that the pent-up demand was 400, and that's actually the starting point of the 400. Like the story behind my 400 is that there was a previous study that said that the pent-up demand to 2027 was 400. So there is a need for additional spectrum, and it's not really that difficult to understand. If you look at how much data usage has been growing, it's just a thing that grows exponentially.
Yeah.
And if you need to meet that demand, you need the spectrum. So it's by 2027 is going to be an additional 400, and that's why I chose the 400.
And I think I wanted to bring the regulatory aspect back. I mean, John, as you're looking out on the fiber side, do you see any particular regulatory barriers in terms of expansion? Number one. Number two, are you seeing any net impact on people's interest or speed of build or interest or building because of the various and sundry subsidy programs, whether it's the beginning of the trickle of the BEAD money or some of the older ARPA money or any money out of RUS? I'm just
Yeah,
curious what your thoughts are there.
yeah. There's that could be an entire conversation just around that. And I don't want to get too caught up in BEAD because, as you can imagine, BEAD was a lot of chatter at the conference around BEAD, and kind of what the pullback on federal or the pause on federal grants mean. I would say there's still cautious optimism about it. I do think, maybe what a lot of the dialogue I heard is that there is a recognition that maybe there needs to be a relaxation in terms of some of the regulations. I think the reality is everyone still understands that ideally, if you can do fiber, and that is what BEAD, for example, that's the preferred technology. But I think there is a recognition that a couple things need to at least be contemplated. One, and as we alluded to, the idea of maybe building out fiber at the core, and then for the very last mile, the serving of the house, utilizing unlicensed FWA to do that is it's a great solution. It's an economical solution. So kind of more of a hybrid network approach, if that can be contemplated, is good. But even beyond that, just if we talk about the regulatory environment as a larger concern, one of the other challenges when you put anything into the ground, and that is whether it's fiber or power going back to our data center discussions, that there are so many challenges in terms of before you can really even get to the point of deploying either the fiber capabilities that are needed for the network, or to build out that power plant. Um, the delays just in terms of being able to get transmission and distribution of power out to serve data centers, the lead times are still so long on that, and there's still so many challenges. So I think if anything, where maybe there's that bit of cautious optimism in the longer term, is the idea of looking more at how can the government look to intelligently relax some of these regulations to enable these things to happen, where maybe it's not as many, duplicative permitting regulations or environment regulations and I know a lot of the states have been advocating for that. There's a recognition that a lot can be done. So hopeful that that's the case, because it really is needed. I mean, as I said, if we think about this holistically, it's not just about deploying fiber, it's just all of the other things that go along with it. And, like I said, power, especially on the data center side, and how data centers are interconnected now with this entire ecosystem. It's a huge area of concern.
And Hector, speaking of regulatory, I mean, as we were just discussing, the FCC has had auction authority for a long time, and now there's a temporary pause because it was not reauthorized. And I think, as we all know, it wasn't done on purpose to deprive the FCC of the ability to do this. It was just one of those things that fell off the table for political reasons.
Yeah.
But so in order for, without getting into the extremely complicated process for the audience about how one arrives at an actual auction for spectrum, I do want to emphasize that in order for new large allocations of spectrum to be identified and made available, there needs to be some activity by Congress. And in order for Congress to move forward, they go through this process called scoring their legislation, which is, if you're going to auction off this asset, how much money do you, FCC, think you're going to raise? Obviously, the FCC doesn't answer that question. It's the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. Hector, I know that there were, there were lots of discussions. Gee, what would an authorization bill that does not identify spectrum, would that be worth some money? Because there's some spectrum already identified by the current FCC chair. In fact, was going to be talked about at today's FCC meeting, that perhaps does not require congressional action for him to be able to conduct an auction, assuming there is congressional action to give him the authority to auction. But you need a score that is going to, presumably be realistic. And one thing I think we have seen when it comes to spectrum auctions, with the exception of perhaps the CBRS, where it was very low power, very, very, very small geographic areas, and essentially really is not an exclusive license. It's a ticket to stand in line and operate until DoD tells you no. That the expectation, that the estimates by CBO have consistently been surpassed by the actual monies raised in the auction. So I'm curious if you could talk about the second piece that you have put out recently, aside from quantifying the economic impact of making up to 400 more megahertz available for the MNOs. What would a score look like if we are looking at, for example, the Senator Cruz's legislation from last session, which is potentially, what was it, somewhere between 500 to 700 megahertz. Just curious, number one, what you looked at, and number two, what were the numbers that you came up with?
Okay, so I think the nature of the second paper and scoring are slightly different. Just for those who are not familiar, for the second paper, what I tried to do is to estimate what would be the auction proceeds of the current spectrum pipeline in the US and the mid-band. So I put together a list of potential candidates of bands and potential bandwidths in those bands of things that are being talked about. So not necessarily putting any credibility to any numbers and say this is going to happen, but it's being discussed. So if it were to happen, how much would it raise? And I came up with about $120 billion for the pipeline. And that roughly matches sort of what would happen with the two bills that are right now, the one bill that is right now being discussed and scored that puts on the table 1,250 megahertz of spectrum, right? So that's sort of the nature of my exercise. High level, 1,250 megahertz, and then the revenues associated to that, 120 billion. So I'm really just trying to estimate those two quantities. Now, for CBO, and I'm really not an expert on how CBOs work, their job is substantially more complicated than mine in this regard, because they do have to put some probabilities to things, and they have to average those numbers. So they would have to say, well, in this particular band, maybe we have 150 megahertz, but maybe we only have 5, or maybe we'll have 10. And maybe it's not full power, maybe it's just a shared environment like CBRS. So they really think through all the potential universes that things that can happen, and then they try to average that in some fashion. And just because of uncertainty, essentially, I think historically they have been on the conservative side, but that's really not because they are sort of terribly worse at predicting prices than the general analyst. It's really because the question they're trying to answer is different from what a general analyst could do. So they are doing estimating average changes on the baseline with a lot of cases. And for example, in my case, I don't have to worry about, oh, is this quantity credible? It's like, if this quantity happened, what would be the price under some circumstances? So I think that's really the big difference between, say, my second paper and what the CBO generally does. Now, if you look at examples where there was a very, well, not very clear, but somewhat clearer mandate, and I think the C-band is a good example of that. So for the C-band, there was some legislation that enabled that. And so CBO looked at it and they said, well, for this particular band in this particular timeline, and I think that that's also really important, maybe the auction proceeds are going to be 32 billion, if I recall correctly. Ended up being substantially more than 82. So that's one example where the actual was higher than the CBO score. But I think the opposite has also happened. If I recall correctly, in the incentive auction, so around 2011, 12, where it was mandated, again, CBO looked into it, and they said, well, we have never seen a double auction. So we need to estimate the price of the spectrum in the forward auction and the reverse auction, and we need to net those numbers. And they said, well, our range is going to be from 10 to 40 or something like that, and our average is 25. I think the actual was closer to 6. So in that particular case, it was reversed. But again, I don't think this is comparing apples to apples, because when we look at auction proceeds, we're really looking at what are the proceeds of a given auction, and what CBO does is scoring legislation, which is related to, but not exactly the same as estimating the revenues of a spectrum auction.
Now, you make a very good point where that back in the early aughts, as they say, it was a totally different kind of auction that had never been put together before. So that I think was certainly a unique characteristic. And I do think there's some frustration, around the Beltway, that CBO, instead of doing something that is clean, more consistent with what you do, which is you just take it on face value and you look at the legislation and you figure out a number, as opposed to inserting a political viewpoint on what they think is going to be politically possible, which is not necessarily within their mandate, but it's certainly something that they engage in.
I think it depends on, and this fully depends on Congress, and I'm pretty sure that the people who construct bills know this really well. But if they make a bill really specific, as in the FCC needs to auction this particular band by this time under these conditions, then the CBO exercise would look very similar to what I did. On the other hand, a bill typically doesn't look like that. It just say, well, some people have to study up to these quantities in this wide range of bands that may or may not come to commercial under some conditions or other conditions. So like I really want to stress that when bills are general in the terms of the bands, the
Right.
quantity of spectrum, and the conditions, then CBO really has no choice but to
Right.
try to average all the cases they can think of.
I know we don't typically have questions from the audience, but I did notice that there is one in the chat, and I think it's pretty straightforward. And, it could be for anyone. And that is, can you discuss the economic impact with regard to the lower 3G, the lower 3G allocation debate between DoD and CTIA? I think,
Yeah,
Jen, this is one of your favorite topics. Anytime we're talking about spectrum and
Yes.
you're asking, do you think DoD will continue to bear hug that? I think it'll be hard to estimate what the economic impact would be of either having access to or not having access to what we call the lower three until there is more certainty as to what's going to happen there. I do think that the conversation about overall 3 gigs, so 345 to 355, which we call ambit from the Trump first administration, and then it's the lower 3, and then in between you have CBRS. I would say what's really interesting is an idea that was put out by AT&T in a CBRS proceeding a couple of months ago, where they threw out the idea that perhaps after 15, maybe more years of the CBRS experiment being out there, it's time to take another look at that band. And given DoD's position, which is they really need only low power closer to their operations, perhaps it makes more sense to have the CBRS moved closer because it is currently low power, small areas, move that closer. We call it moving like uses closer to like uses, freeing up that mid part, and then you can auction that off as full power commercial right in the mid band. I mean, it's a perfect sweet spot for the MNOs. So that proposal will likely have to be put out for a public discussion by the FCC, or maybe not. I think it's a procedural issue, but it certainly is a step back and an assessment of maybe there's a way to do this in a better fashion. I don't think that's going to solve any of the larger needs for more spectrum, but it certainly, Jen, is a different way of thinking about what's going to happen in the 3 gigahertz band altogether.
And that's very interesting. And I guess I would just also make a comment, and this brings in John back. We're sitting at what, February 27th, 6th, whatever date we're at. The year started that there's going to be a flood of M&A. We haven't really seen much. I mentioned there's a lot of bankers probably around you right now. And I do think we always have to be careful citing like numbers, 100, like Carolyn, I sent you an email yesterday that some are predicting $180 billion for spectrum. The carriers are my view, and I'm curious if you both agree to this, are very sensitive and spent the last 2 years repairing their balance sheets. I think, the spectrum's only worth what those carriers are willing to pay for it. And I mean, John, is that a message down there? Also, fiber is getting more expensive, not less.
Right. It is. I think both. Yes, I believe both of those things are right, Jennifer. I don't think it's for a lack of want for spectrum, but as you said, some of the economic realities of recent spectrum spending experiences and what it has meant to those companies, I think has forced them to approach it differently and say, okay, what can we do from a technology perspective with the spectrum that we have to more optimally utilize what we have versus just thinking about, well, we'll just go buy more. So yes, I do think that is part of it. As far as the second part of your question, I I do think that is a potential challenge again overall for the industry, whether we're talking about data centers, we're talking about fiber. But if let's just narrow it in on fiber, the economics of fiber deployment are not going to get less. They're not going to get less costly. They're going to get more costly. And it is something that we keep cautioning people on is that look, BEAD is a perfect example. It was part of when we spoke over the last years. As you're contemplating this, you have to be building contingency into your plans for when costs increase, because the thing is if you look just purely at BEAD, these are build outs that are happening in very remote locations. And so if you've already got fiber builds that are happening in big cities, and there's, all, like we said, there's activity across the board. If you've already got, you've got OSP techs that are busy, you have ISP techs that are being busy. All of the higher end ISP techs are being repurposed for use within doing ISP within data centers. All of a sudden, maybe your cost modeling that you built all of your plans around, they very likely have changed from when you initially contemplated it. Because again, raw materials have gotten more expensive or just not available.
Yes.
The equipment to go do it, trying to get a directional boring truck, good luck. Trying to get somebody that knows how to do fiber splicing right now, good luck. So yes, on both sides of that, yeah, I think you're exactly right from a cost sensitivity or a cost concern perspective.
And I think, Jen, on the spectrum side, I think the companies are essentially held hostage, right? So the FCC agencies, will tell you, we're doing this and we're going to auction at this point, and you don't have the luxury of saying, well, actually, that doesn't work for me. Can you hold it off for another year? Right. And so it's everything that John was just saying, and then it gets even more complicated on the spectrum side, because you basically have to deal with the rules once the federal government sets them, and it may not coincide with when it makes sense for your capital outlays. So I see that we are almost, we have 2 more minutes before our deadline. I think we've covered quite a bit. The one aspect of this convergence discussion that we don't have here, but it's certainly one that we'll pull in the future, is satellite. We see satellite capability to the phone. AT&T just put out a big statement, an announcement, and I know the other carriers are doing the same. You've got, the growing potential competition between your Amazon satellite and your Elon Musk satellite solutions, et cetera. So a lot going on there that's also being integrated into what we're doing here on the ground. But I think we at least kicked off this conversation of convergence, and it sounds like you guys both agree that, at least for fiber and spectrum, they go hand in glove. They are, wouldn't say interdependent, but they complement each other.
They complement, yes.
They're both extending the reach of the other. Is kind of what I heard.
Absolutely.
Great.
Jen,
They are
any
interconnected.
last minute highlights? Or I know you always like to close with a really good question about, a black swan or something provocative. Not to
I guess, well, maybe that's it. What are you guys seeing that others aren't? That the street or the investors or the regulators should be aware of?
I'll just really quickly echo what I just said before. I think this is something that maybe they're thinking about, but it is top of mind and something that people should be thinking about, as far as there is a labor shortage for this space right now. And so there's got to be creativity from the states, from the private and public sector, to figure out how to collaborate on building out a workforce, investing in putting funds towards building out workforces that can enable this architecture going forward. I think that is a critical concern. And while it's being talked about, there needs to be a lot more action taken on that front.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to spectrum, I think that the long-term trends on data growth, people really need to start analyzing the past and creating some expectations for the future. If we just rely on the mobile connectivity as we know it, so imagine like 4G, 5G type of thing, then it has clearly slowed down, like from 50s to 40s to 30s, and I think right now we are at the 18% annually. But if AI, for example, starts to kick in, coming into the phones, then it's going to start growing up again. And the demand for the spectrum is going to grow if the data keeps growing faster than expected, or it's going to reduced if it grows less than expected. So that is really, it's a critical thing to look at the impact of AI and other technologies into how data is going to grow, data demand is going to grow in the future.
Great.
Thank you both
Thank
very
you
much.
both. That was a great session and really a great way to enter the second quarter, essentially, which are almost there.
We're still only in
One more month.
February, Jen.
Yeah. I'm
Still only
wishing it away.
February.
Wishing it away.
Thank you all very, very much for
Midwest
your
girl
time.
trying to will the warmth to us.
Thank you both. That was great, guys. Thank you,
Thank you
Carol.
both very
Always
much.
good to see you.
Jen,
Jen,
thank you.
see you
Bye.
soon.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.